Because like I looked up on the site.
You know, so I was in the library. I was your phone. Or phone. Not your case.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. This is great. We have a wonderful guest this afternoon. This is an esteemed colleague and also a personal friend of mine, Swedlund, and she's joining us from Radboud University in the Netherlands. And she actually has quite an interesting geographical trajectory. She's from Iowa, went to undergrad in Texas, graduate in New York, and then took a job in the Netherlands. So she's had quite the travels. But she's here to talk to us today about her new book project, which is looking at foreign aid and what the relationships look like between donor agencies and domestic governments and all the interesting things that happen in those intersecting relationships. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to talk for a little bit and then open it up for questions. So if you have anything you want to ask, line and fire away.
And if there are any questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me. I'm perfectly also happy to do that. So thanks very much for having me, and also to Dr. Bostorino. It's nice to come and also get to see her. So as she said, I'm working on this new book project, which I've tentatively titled The Development Dance. So for the past 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, I guess, I've been traveling around sub-Saharan Africa talking to key decision makers of donor governments. So what I mean by a donor is, for example, the U.S. government has USAID. You may have heard of the agency. So within each country that they operate, they have a certain mission office. So I talk to the country director or the person that's in charge of particular projects within the country that I'm interested in. And then also talking to representatives of governments, mainly within the ministries of finance in the countries where I've been working. So I've been in Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, and also in Ghana. In addition to the interviews that I've been doing, I've also been doing a large and online survey of donor officials, and that is currently in progress, but eventually will be done in 20 countries. So I have this kind of different, interesting collection of data based on qualitative work, and then also based on this survey work. So what I want to talk to you today is about the basic ideas and theoretical frameworks, and also then how I started to think about how to translate that theoretical framework into the actual research that I did on the ground. But before I talk to you about my theoretical framework, I want to just give you a little bit of background on foreign aid and talk about some key concepts so that we're all kind of on the same page. Oh, on there. Okay, so the first question that it's important to think about is, well, who gives foreign aid and why do they actually give foreign aid? Right? So the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the major international organization that oversees development assistance from the West, from the US and from Europe, defines foreign aid as financial flows, technical assistance, and commodities that have 2 purposes. So the first is that they're designed to promote economic development and welfare as their main objective. And second, they have to be provided as either grants or loans. So what this means is if Barclays Bank or Bank of America decides to give a loan to the Ugandan government that they then use for economic development, this isn't foreign aid because it wasn't given at a special subsidized rate. It has to be given with a special subsidized rate and to have the primary purpose be economic development in that country, for it to be classified as official development assistance. So this chart, I don't know how well everyone can see in the back, but what this shows is who are the major donors to foreign aid. So you can see this is from 2008. The major donor in this time period has been the World Bank. Then under that, the US. We also have the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Many of you have probably heard about them. And then you have Japan and the European communities. So you can see here on the charts, you probably can't actually, but you can see the yellow line, which is the IMF and the World Bank. They're up close to $75 billion. So we're not talking about small amounts of money, right? We're talking about large volumes of aid transfers that get transferred all over the world to developing countries each and every year. So then we need to think a little bit about, well, why is it that the US government thinks that it's a good idea to give foreign aid to recipient countries? So we know we have lots of problems at home, right? We have problems with poverty, we have problems with all kinds of education systems. So why is it that you think that the US government decides to give foreign aid abroad? Any ideas? Yeah?
To promote democracy.
To promote democracy? Okay, so they have certain normative goals. Any other goals they might have? Yeah?
Foster relations.
Yeah, foster relations. Those are two really good components. So of course, at some level, we like to think that foreign aid is given for an altruistic reason, right? So it certainly probably has some charitable element in it. That we recognize that on the global level, there are huge disparities in income, and that some type of redistribution of income might be necessary. But we also give foreign aid for a lot of other reasons. We give foreign aid, for example, for commercial reasons. So if the US government provides foreign aid to a recipient country, it may mean that within that recipient country, US businesses receive preferential agreements or preferential trade deals. So it can help to establish these commercial ties. Same thing goes for diplomatically, right? And I think a good example of this is in the Ukrainian crisis, right? So you may have seen on the news that a couple of weeks ago, the US Congress approved a $1 billion grant to Ukraine, or $1 billion in foreign aid to Ukraine. Now, of course, that's given to some degree because the Ukrainian government needs that funding at this time. But it also very much has a political reason for giving that, right? It allows, suggests to the Ukrainian government, well, potentially if you can be a bit more favorable to our government and to our positions, that this can be interesting, or that this is an important purpose. Then, but the kind of major question that's been driving foreign aid and the literature on foreign aid is of course, well, does it actually work, right? So we've had foreign aid. The modern foreign aid system kind of got started basically in the Marshall Plan. So following World War II, you had the distribution of large amounts of aid to Western Europe, mainly for Reconstruction. But the type of foreign aid that I'm talking about and the system really got started in the 70s. But we've had it still for several decades. And there are a lot of people who wonder, okay, well, why is it that we still see so much poverty in so many places in the world? We've had billions of dollars that are transferred each and every year. Has it actually worked? You have three kind of major camps on this. So the first camp is what you could call the aid optimists, right? So these individuals would argue they're optimistic about foreign aid, that on average, in controlling for other factors, aid has led to rapid growth, to economic growth. So these individuals are not saying that every time you give foreign aid, the foreign aid works. So they would say that sometimes you have certain factors, for example, diminishing returns, which means that when you give foreign aid to begin with, it may do a lot of good for the first, say, $1 million. But then at a certain point, it starts to level out and actually how much effect it would have. But they would say if you control for all of these different types of factors, we do see that it has had a positive effect on growth in recipient countries, and therefore we need to continue to provide it, right? On the other hand, you have the aid pessimists, and they argue that, not surprisingly, that it may actually not affect growth, but could actually even undermine it. So why do you think that giving foreign aid, giving cash transfers to recipient country government might actually undermine growth? So it might actually be counterintuitive. Any ideas? Yeah?
Corruption?
Yeah, it's a perfect example, right? So if you give foreign aid to a government that's corrupt or doesn't actually spend it, then potentially there's also a lot of political scientists who have talked about this could keep that government in power. Right? So if you think about it in terms of accountability lines, when we provide, who's funding the US government is taxpayers, right? So you or your parents provide taxes and that's what funds the government. It creates this accountability link between you, and you also have the ability to elect your representatives and to do all kinds of, have those connections. In a recipient country, you oftentimes don't have, first of all, as strong of democratic procedures, but on the other hand, the majority of the funding could be coming from foreign governments, which decreases this accountability line and makes the recipient government accountable to the donors instead of to their own citizens. And so a lot of political scientists have focused on the idea that this could allow governments to remain in power, that we actually, if they would have had to have been accountable to their own people, would have already been kicked out of office many years ago. You also have a lot of people who talk about just the ability to use the amount of aid that's given. So do you actually have the capacity, do you actually have the infrastructure in your ministries to effectively use that type of foreign aid? And then it can have all kinds of other perverse incentives. But then you have this kind of third group, which is where a lot of people fall, that I would call the aid pragmatists, right? So people like to be in the middle, so this is where a lot of people end up. And they would say that, aid doesn't always work, but at some level, it can provide an amount of foreign, can provide a conditional relationship on growth, right? So, and what they would point out is probably talk about three different things. So the first is that what might matter are the characteristics of the recipient government themselves. And this seems kind of obvious, but you had a really famous and influential paper in the late 90s that made the argument, well, foreign aid works better in places where you have good policy. Okay? It makes sense, but if you think about it, it's an interesting kind of finding down the line, because the corollary is that, well, if aid works better in the places that have good policy, we should only actually be giving aid to the places who have good policy. Well, what does that mean? That means that a lot of the countries who actually are the least developed and the poorest wouldn't actually be receiving any foreign aid. So you have a lot of controversy about what are kind of the implications of this, right? It may be true that a government, of course, that has better policies is better able to use it, but does that mean that we just completely ignore the places who don't have those policies? You also have debates on the type of aid itself. So aid can have lots of different variation, and many people have pointed out that there are a lot of practices by donors themselves that are very different, or very, can undermine the effectiveness. So a key example of this is something called tide aid. So what tide aid is the idea that, and the US often gives a lot of tide aid, but when you give foreign aid to a recipient country, that the aid itself actually has to be spent on products from the donor country. So you have, for example, food aid in Ethiopia. After you have a famine in Ethiopia and the USAID provides food aid, that food is actually purchased from farmers in the United States. So that aid has to be shipped all the way across the world. So this cuts down on, first of all, the amount that you can produce. It also, many people have argued that it undermines the local markets in those countries, right? But there's, of course, a very specific reason why Congress does that. It's then not only, they can justify providing foreign aid because they're saying, well, we're supporting US farmers. So there's a lot of interesting debates here, and it's actually becoming more and more prevalent because you may have heard that China is in Africa, right? This is a new big thing that everyone's talking about. And you had a lot of people pushing the US and pushing other donors to move away from tide aid. But most of the aid that China gives is actually tide. So now you're seeing the kind of emergence of these new debates. So these are the kind of broad debates within foreign aid. And within that, I'm now going to tell you what I've been working on. And in many ways, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to shift the question. So most of the literature has been driven by this idea that what we need to study is whether foreign aid is effective. But I think that there's another question that we need to ask before we get to the effectiveness question. And that is, what is driving the practices of foreign aid? And what is driving what I'm calling institutional innovation? So within foreign aid, in the past, in the 4 to 5 decades that we've seen the kind of dominance or this kind of modern aid system, we've actually seen a lot of changes in foreign aid. So one thing that people will tell you as well, there's all kinds of fashions in foreign aid. One day it's agriculture, the next day it's education, then now something that I'm really interested in was the push towards budget support, which is just a direct transfer into the treasury of the recipient country government. You might ask why that is necessarily a good idea if you have countries that are highly corrupt, and that was kind of one of the questions that was driving my research to begin with. So what I want to do is, instead of asking why aid is effective, I want to ask, well, why do we see changes in foreign aid over time? And I think this can eventually help us to understand why we see ineffectiveness in aid, but I want to start with this question and get to that question down the line. And so in order to do this, I need to know what donors and recipient countries' governments bargain over. So what it is that they actually discuss and talk about, the details of those types of communication. And this is pretty complicated, so this cartoon, if you can see it, right? Like the Development Systems Conference, Rocket Science Conference, next time let's go to the Rocket Science Conference, it's got to be a lot more straightforward. These bargaining negotiations are actually incredibly complex. So what I'm trying to do is simplify it a little bit into a conceptual model that I can then go out and test. So what is my theory? So the first part of the theory is that recipients and donors bargain over three things. So the first thing they bargain over is how much aid they get to begin with. Then they bargain over how the government spends the money. So what the technical aspects of that money being spent. And then they bargain over how much political reform the government has to undertake in order to get the money. So oftentimes when a recipient country receives a financial aid package, they have to say we will do X, Y, and Z in order to get those funds. So that's part of the bargaining process. This is not new for me. This is from the theory, right? I'm building on previous theory which exists. What I'm adding to it is that I'm saying that the credibility of the promises they're able to make are constrained. And they're constrained by what I call commitment problems. Now, commitment problems are the idea that it's very difficult for you to make a long-term commitment because you don't actually have ways to sanction. The other party doesn't have ways to sanction or enforce. So I think an example maybe from your life is, let's say you promise your mom that you're going to go home for a weekend, right? So maybe your grandma's having a party or something like this, and you're supposed to go home for this weekend. Then you find out that on campus there's going to be a much more exciting social event that you want to go to. What's to say keep you from just staying on campus and not going home as you promised your mom? There's no sanctions per se, right, for doing that. Well, the same thing happens within foreign aid. Donors and governments get together, they make these agreements, but there's actually very little way to uphold the promises or the commitments that they've made. Now, we can think about, well, why might that be true? So we're dealing with governments, right? Let's talk first on the recipient country side. So you have a recipient country, they go through a long negotiation with the World Bank or with another donor, and they come up with a whole series of things that they're going to do in order to receive the funding. Then you have an election, right? So during that election, maybe it makes sense that we give a little bit of money to this particular group, or we give a little bit of money to this particular district, and all of a sudden our budget is much more varied, and it's much more, it's not near as precise as the donor has required them. So one of the requirements of donors is often that you have certain sound fiscal principles. So all of a sudden we've kind of forgotten those fiscal principles because we want to reward individuals that will support us in the election. And then let's say you actually have the election, and now all of a sudden you have a new government. Well, that new government doesn't actually have to uphold what the other government has already said that they were going to do. So you have as a donor, there's actually very little sanctioning power that you have, right? But I think what's been even more explored is what I would call donor commitment problems. So it's also simultaneously very difficult for donors to make long-term commitments. For the same reasons. Say you have an election and you have a new government that comes to power in the US or Canada and Europe. Broadly speaking, conservative governments tend to provide less aid than more liberal governments. So you have the election of a more conservative government, all of a sudden foreign aid budgets are slashed and there's no longer as much money to give as you promised to the recipient country government. This happened in the Netherlands where I'm at, not because of an election of a new government, although that was part of it, but because you had a financial crisis in Europe. So the Dutch government slashed foreign aid budgets by 40%, a huge percentage, which means that in all of the countries where I'm working, foreign aid that was promised is no longer materializing. Actually, in Tanzania, it meant that foreign aid from the Dutch government was entirely withdrawn, so the office entirely closed. So my argument is that this pliability affects the promises that donors and governments can make. And so that part of the bargaining process of these parties is that they're trying to actually not only bargain about these three things, about advocating their interests, but they're also trying to create aid practices and aid modalities, which is often the term that's used, in order to improve the commitments, right? In order to improve how well each part, the commitments that each party is able to make. And so that it's not just about always advocating for your interests, but it's also about designing new aid modalities which are supposed to promise more commitments. And so this is why we see fashions in foreign aid. This is why we see changes, because each time we see a new change, part of that process, it's not just about, okay, now we care more about agriculture, or now we care more about the state. It's because each party is trying to bargain and negotiate in order to find a compromise that allows them to give the other party to uphold their commitments. The corollary of this, though, is that, this kind of leads me to two predictions, that institutional innovation, or changes in foreign aid, is driven by an attempt to decrease commitment problems, but that without self-enforcing mechanisms, so without the ability to sanction the other party, this institutional innovation will just continue over time, right? So we'll constantly see the fashions coming in and out. So are there any questions at this point? Yeah.
When the donor country gives the aid to whatever, let's say just for example, we're giving aid to a country that has a government that doesn't always have a tendency to really work with us.
Yeah.
Why can't the donor country, use some more like an international organization like the UN to kind of say, make sure this aid goes here, and kind of use not military, but kind of just have almost like a security with it? Why can't it?
So the term that is often given is political conditionality. So we make aid conditional on you potentially fulfilling these different types of things. The problem is that historically we've learned that doesn't actually work very well, because you have this sense of commitment problems. So in the 80s, we had something called structural adjustment, right? So the World Bank was giving large amounts of aid to donor countries, and they were saying in order to receive this money, you had to do these kind of 10 things. And there were a lot of people who were very critical of those 10 things that they had to do, because they tended to be cutting social services and other things. But you also saw from that what happened is that the recipient country government just said, okay, sure, we'll do these things, we'll sign your loans, and then we actually didn't do it. And now your question is about, well, why can't we increase the sanctioning mechanism? But what actually would that sanctioning mechanism be?
Well, I'm thinking like in terms of like, as you're giving out the aid, like literally, I know the UN will go to the countries and be giving out, like why don't they use that instead of like saying to the government, let's just hope the government.
But how can they enforce that? The problem is that there's an enforcement problem, right? So with international organizations, also because they have their own reasons. The UN is controlled by its member countries. So they might, first of all, be more favorable to taking certain policies. It's also a bureaucracy. It has lots of different ways that it could potentially go. And there's very little actual way for them to sanction the government when they don't do it. Besides, the biggest sanctioning mechanism actually would come from the original donor, from the US. And that would be just withdrawing their aid altogether. And that sometimes happens, right? So recently in Uganda, you may have heard in the news that the Ugandan government passed strong anti-homosexuality bills. And some donors have said, okay, this was the line, we told you that this was the line. Obama was also publicly spoke on this, and they've withdrawn aid. The thing about it is that when you're talking about USAID budgets, what they're actually going to cut is about 10% of foreign aid. So it's this very small, donor governments are oftentimes even if they have the ability to make enforcement, they're very reluctant to actually use it. And this goes back even to the point that was made earlier, and that's because foreign aid isn't just given for altruistic reasons. It's given for commercial reasons, it's given for diplomatic reasons. And in the case of Uganda, Uganda is a very strong partner on the war on terror, for example. And they're a very strong partner in military exercises. So it would be difficult for the US government to just say, okay, we're just going to withdraw from Uganda, even if we don't like the specific policy. Yeah?
So, how much of this conditional phasing that goes on, let's take a simple analogy. You're building a house. Right, you have to take draws out. It has to be inspected. There's at certain phases. So how much of this foreign aid is actually set up on a realistic time window, taking into consideration elections and all the rest of it, where it's like, all right, from this point to this point, you get X amount. Trust but verify. You did it. We're going to release the other part. You guys got to understand something. This is the way our system works. New government comes into place. It can be whacked. So we're going on this, looking into the future, going, this is on the table right now, understanding that it could go away. I mean, does that happen?
Yeah, so the thing that's difficult, I'm not sure if you're talking from the recipient country side or if you're talking from the donor side, but from the recipient, so I'll start with the recipient country side. It's very difficult for a recipient country to, first of all, think of, the organizations that are managing aid in recipient countries in the Ministry of Finance, it's 5 guys in a room that are responsible for managing billions, and I say men because it's usually men, that are managing large amounts of foreign aid from very complicated different donor procedures. So the US, for example, has a very different way of distributing foreign aid than the Netherlands, or than Germany, or Japan. Right? So they have to manage all these different individual procurement systems, and that's incredibly complicated for them to keep track of and for them to budget and plan for. There is institutional knowledge about knowing which donors actually deliver on their promises and which don't. In Uganda, they discount aid, and they discount it by the specific donor. They won't tell you exactly what figures they discount, but they know a bit in their head, right, how likely it is for a particular government to actually fulfill a particular donor. On the donor side, you also have something called there's an incentive to distribute aid. Right? So if I am the country director of USAID in Uganda, I want my programs to be successful. I want my programs to be successful because I want foreign aid to be helpful to Uganda, but also because it's good for my career. Right? It's good for my career if foreign aid is distributed, if all of my money that I was given, if I'm able to effectively use it, if I'm able to show my boss, Congress, that I've delivered aid in this way. So, there certainly is attempts to go about this, but it's incredibly difficult because of the complexity of the situation, and because, well, when you have, and also because the nature of politics, right, certain things happen and change. I've talked a lot about Uganda, but that's because I was there last, but you had a movement, when Uganda began to reform and open up more, actually what was quite interesting is then Museveni, the president, wanted to maintain his power base, right? So money began just being distributed quite interestingly. And for donors, actually, of course, we might want to promote democracy, but actually when you have this introduction and this opening of democracy, things fall through the cracks a little bit, right? And it becomes much more difficult for them to manage. And I actually see a lot of evidence in my interviews that there's this very strong tension with donor officials, right? They know normatively that they want these kind of certain democratic elements, but it's more difficult for them to manage that because they don't actually know what's going to occur and what's actually going to happen. Whereas if you have a very strong authoritarian state, that your director can sit with the president or can sit with the permanent secretary and he's going to tell you exactly what's going to happen, it's easier for you. I think a good example of this is in Ghana. As a part of foreign aid, donors wanted the Ghanaian government to promise that they would pass a bill in Parliament that would clarify how oil revenues were managed. So they wanted to institute good fiscal policy, and they said, okay, in order for you to get this money, you have to pass this certain bill. Well, the people that are agreeing to this are the Ministry of Finance, and their response was, but that's Parliament's job. It's not our job as a Ministry of Finance to pass a bill. And so you have this big battle between donors and the country, because in many ways what they were wanting them to do was guarantee a passage by a democratically elected body, which may or may not want to pass that bill. So you have all these kind of interesting tensions. Are there any other questions? Okay, so then what I wanted to just talk about is, well, the question, well, what do we actually need? So in order for this theory that I've outlined for you quite briefly, and without a lot of the theoretical backing where it comes from, but what do we need for the theory to be valid? Well, I think that we need to see three things. So first, we just actually have to see evidence of commitment problems. So I've told you lots of reasons why this might be true, but of course, empirically, we have to actually go out and look to see, is it actually very difficult for donors and recipient countries to make strong commitments? If it's not, then my theory is invalid, right? It goes away. The second thing we need to see is we need to see evidence that new changes, so these new emergence of new practices, come about in part because the two parties think that they're going to actually help solve commitment problems. So if everyone tells me, no, we switched to this new policy because we now actually believe in something different, or we actually changed our interest, then that's undermining my argument. Because I'm saying that these interest and normative commitments are staying somewhat the same, but that what's changing is this desire to improve commitment problems. And likewise, we need to see evidence that when bargaining compromises fail, so when we see a shift away from a practice, that it occurs because of this commitment problem. So how I thought about going out and test this. So first of all, what I was specifically looking at was a shift to a new type of giving aid. So I won't go into a lot of details, but in the early 2000s, you had a shift to something, as I talked about, called budget support. And it's literally a direct cash transfer into the recipient country government. This is not something that the US government provides, for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. But many European countries started using this type of aid modality, started using using budget support. In Rwanda, for example, at one time, the European Commission was giving 70% of its aid this way. It was $250 million that were being transferred directly into the Rwandan government's treasury. So I was interested, okay, why is this actually occurring? What is interesting about this? And so I went to go and look at why the shift occurred, and now actually why we're seeing the shift away from this practice. And I thought about doing that through interviews with donors and with recipient country government, or recipient government officials in 4 countries. So in Ghana, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, and Uganda. I picked these countries because they're the countries that received some of the highest amounts of budget support. So it was a good place to look at these aid modalities. So what I've done is I've just been talking to people, right? So as I'm sure you've talked about, I developed my interview protocol, and I went in, I started speaking with people. I've done about 150 interviews. It's not always easy to get access to people, but you just keep bugging them, keep calling and calling and calling, and eventually they somehow decide to pick up your call. And it's also been quite fun and interesting, right? I ended up in lots of odd situations, including one time I was picked up in a parking lot in Dar es Salaam by a big fancy government vehicle with several TVs inside it, and then driven to a permanent secretary's office. Another time I thought I was going for a very informal conversation with a colleague that I had met only to arrive at the Ministry of Finance to a full table full of people that were there to speak with me, and a waiter with a chef's hat, and all kinds of services that were laid out for me. So you never know what you're going to get, but that also makes it fun, right? You get to talk to people, and you get to speak with people about different elements. And I've gotten to talk to a lot of really interesting people. So from donor officials to permanent secretaries to governors of national banks, so the Ben Bernankes of the countries that I've been to. And that's been really enjoyable. Now I'm in the process of going through all of that data. I have pages and pages and pages of transcripts, so I have to figure out how to go through it and code it and analyze it. But the other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, because I'm not going to do a lot of empirical stuff, but I did want to just show you a little bit of what my dad was telling me, is that I've done this large end survey of donor officials. And that I started last year because I realized I had all this qualitative data on processes and mechanisms, but what I wanted to be able to do was to give a chart that said, okay, so and so many people say this, right? And then to go use my qualitative research in order to play out the processes and explain that. And so I started doing this survey. Unfortunately, I'm only able to do it of donor officials. It's just not possible to do an online survey of government officials in the countries where I'm working. But it's been really interesting, and I hope to have about 200 people respond in the end. So it's a nice amount of data. So what I don't think. So I just have 2 more slides, and what I wanted to do is just to give you a sense of some of the things that I'm finding from my interviews. So back here, I told you that we need to see 3 things, and I want to just talk about just this top one, evidence of commitment problems. So on this government commitment problems, here, it's hard for me to see that. These are just some quotes from some of the individuals. I'm also in the process of going through my data, so I'm kind of pulling things out at the moment. But you can, this first quote was with a bilateral donor last April in Accra. The government really want donors really want the government to achieve certain goals, but the government actually has its own agenda as well. And basically, they're like, well, we do what we want. So what are you going to do about it? That's basically sometimes a feeling from the development partner's side that they really lack the power to enforce the measures that they would like the government to do. And then the second one is very similar, right? I would say that it's probably one of the greatest frustrations. And this last one, we can only plant the seeds, but if anybody in government doesn't want to do something, they're not going to do it. So one question I asked of every person I interviewed was, what are the greatest frustrations that donors have over their government counterparts? And what are the greatest frustrations that government officials have of their donor counterparts? And I asked that to each person. I asked both questions to each person. And I think actually out of all the questions I asked, that's yielded some of the richest information. So what this suggests to me is that we really see a lot of evidence for commitment problems, and it's very difficult for the parties. These are quite representative of the people that I talked to. It's not just I pulled out 3 nice quotes that support my findings. And then if we think about donor commitment problems, so the ability of donors to make long-term commitments, this is from my survey, so as of now has an N of about 52. But what I asked is, in country X, so in the country in which the survey is being administered, is it difficult for your agency to do these 3 things? The first is disperse promise aid on time, give accurate predictions of disbursements 1 year in advance, and give accurate predictions of disbursements 3 years in advance. So the dark one is very difficult, the other one is moderately difficult. So for the first 2 questions, 61% say that it's difficult for them to do so, moderately or very difficult. To give for 3 years in advance, it goes up to 91%. And so it suggests that for donors, it's actually very difficult for them to give long-term promises to donor recipient countries. So I think there, I'll just leave it at that for now, and then open it up for questions and discussions. Yeah.
Sorry. So you had mentioned that like changes in government, like either in the home, like the donor country or the recipient country, kind of lead to, I guess, maybe like the deal of foreign aid not falling through. Would that be one of the reasons why, in the long term, 3 years or something? Is that one really driving?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big one that's probably consistent across all of them, because you have lots of things that are very specific to the donor country themselves. So the way the U.S. gives foreign aid is very different than other countries because it has to be approved by Congress. So that makes it very difficult for USAID to make long-term commitments because they're always dependent on the Congress saying yes or no, and Congress changes and has different political opinions. In other donor countries, that process is more separated from a parliamentary body like Congress. It's more of a minister of finance who's making decisions based on the amount of aid that he's given. So there is variation, but this is one of the very big reasons, right? It's difficult to make these long-term promises. It makes sense, right? It's not so difficult to think that well, yeah, the priorities of a country may change, right? You have a financial crisis and suddenly we need more money at home, or suddenly we need more money to spend, our priorities as a nation have changed, and foreign aid becomes less of a priority.
I'm just curious to see, what do you see as your main contribution of this research? Are you more looking into provide history of institutional innovations, how we built on them, what's happened, and then perhaps make some kind of suggestions about how to get it right? Are you more interested in polishing your theoretical model, talking about perhaps causes and factors affecting how these negotiations and aid disbursement go on?
Yeah, I think the former. It's a good question that I also should think about a bit more, but for me what was really surprising is when we look at the foreign aid literature that no one actually has a theory for understanding why we see these changes over time. So it's fairly common to read a remark here or there about things going in and out of fashion, but there's very little understanding of why that actually occurs. And so I think that it's a gap that's really missing. I think down the long term, it can also, I didn't get to this, but it can also tell us why aid is a bit ineffective as well. And there I think I can make some policy contributions. But at this point, the idea is really kind of putting out these theoretical ideas and having them tested and evaluated, and then I have to go from there.
Yeah, but I think if you are doing this as a book project, if you have a chapter on policy, that would be really solid.
Yeah, and that will be the conclusions, but I haven't in any way gotten to written, so yeah. And I mean, I think there my argument, is fairly simple in the fact that, well, if we really we have to figure out a way to solve commitment problems. But I don't have an answer for is how we would actually do that. And that's, I think, what needs to be more talked about in the conclusions chapter that I've been thinking about for years and still don't have a very good answer to.
So on these aid projects, when they go into it, are these set up initially, as a general rule, long-term, or are they looking at short-term, smaller stages to get to a big one, or are they starting out with this grandiose plan that these commitment problems make an issue for?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variation. So you have you can think about giving aid in two different types of ways. The first is project aid. So we give project to build, it can be a small project. We can build a school that's one room in rural Uganda. Or it can be a very large project that goes on, for example, building a railroad, so a massive infrastructure project. And then you have what's called program aid. And that type of aid is given, it's a cash transfer. It can be given as a loan, it can be given as a grant. Budget support, this aid modality that I was talking about, is a part of that category. And what I was really interested in is why we saw a shift from a lot more project aid to this type of program aid. Because in project aid, in theory, you could have a bit more control, right? It's generally set up, a donor, for example, sets up an agency. So they set up a specific unit called project implementation unit. And they're established for maybe, let's say the project is expected to go for 5 years or 10 years. It's a separate office, it's set up by USAID. It may be staffed by local Ugandans, but it's actually managed and paid for by USAID. Whereas the other option is really, we give you a cash transfer and we tell you how we think you should spend it, but at the end of the day, you can spend it in different ways, right? It's called fungible. It can be spent in lots of different elements. So there's a lot of variation there. But oftentimes, even in this second one where it's a transfer of aid, it can depend. You can give it in a lump sum for the whole year, or other donors might give it every 3 months or every different period. So there's it's a lot of variation and contrasting in how donors do it. Yeah.
So I know this is not part of your project.
Yeah.
But I also know that you've done work on transnational NGOs.
Yep.
And so I wonder how many of these same issues arise when we're talking about, non-governmental organizations giving aid. There's a little bit more certainty on the part of the NGO that they don't have to deal with this democratic turnover, right? Do they suffer from the same commitment issues, or have they figured it out in some way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I would say first of all, that actually NGOs can be a part of this, because so if you're giving aid in this project type format, it's usually, so an NGO is supposed to be a non-governmental organization, right? But oftentimes a lot of their funding comes from the government. So when you give project aid to build a school, it's not as if that NGO all of a sudden just had this money and decided to distribute it. It often came from the US government or from another donor agency. So this is one way why people thought, okay, it's a good idea, we're going to bypass all these local NGOs and these different actors, and we're just going to give the money to the state. Right? Because in Africa, we see states that don't have a lot of capacity, don't have a lot of strength, and we want to help build state structures and state capacities instead of building NGOs, which then operate outside of the state. I heard an interesting, one time when I was in Rwanda, someone told me, well, Columbia University, in some way or another, staffs about 1/3 of Rwanda's medical facilities. So I think this is a bit exaggerated, but it does show you the amount. I mean, if you had, in many countries, if you had NGOs and international actors that pulled out of these countries, health services would fall apart, education services will fall apart. You have an interesting now in Afghanistan, right? So with the US pullout, a lot of education is managed by CARE, by the big NGO. And now they're trying to figure out, well, how do we hand it over to the Ministry of Education? So this is to say that NGOs are actually not necessarily separate from this story. If they receive their money from donations from individuals, then potentially they operate a little bit outside of this web. But it's actually quite complicated in how they're involved in that way. And I think, as to say whether or not they face commitment problems, my inclination would be to say that they face the exact same ones and haven't figured it out. But I haven't done research on that.
So this may be one of the trends that is no longer really as in fashion, but my understanding of this was that there was at least an attempt for a while, maybe about 10 years ago, to sort of basically have the government give money to the NGOs, and then the NGOs have to figure out how to measure their success, and that would therefore get them their next round of funding or not.
Yeah.
So that sort of was trying to decouple government accountability so that their job was then to hold the NGO accountable, right, rather than having all the same goals. So I guess my first question is that still one of the trends? And is that actually maybe working for getting more accountability on the delivery, but the NGO still has the problem of, are we going to have funding in 3 years? So it wouldn't solve that problem.
Yeah, so I mean, the shift towards the state, and here there's a spectrum of donors in what they prioritize, and on one end of the spectrum, I would say, although things are kind of in flux right now, you have the US, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have European, specifically DFID. So DFID was really pushing this budget support agenda, and is now backing away from it because of a lot of interesting reasons. But so I think in terms of US foreign aid, there's still a lot of this going on, right?
Which actually would explain why I think more of it's going on in Latin America, because more US aid would be going there.
Yeah.
Than more Europe to Africa.
And I mean, one of the reasons why I became interested in budget support is because it actually is not something that we talk a lot about in the US, because the US doesn't give this type of aid. But for European countries, it was dominating a very specific part of their funding. And this wasn't part of this talk, but the stuff that I published before on budget support was really making the argument that budget support wasn't about donors trying to get out and let recipient countries do what they wanted to. It was about donors actually trying to get influence in a different way. So by becoming a budget support donor, that meant that they got to meet with the Minister of Finance on a regular basis. That meant that they got a louder voice to speak, because instead of funding, you know, I have a really nice quote from someone. He says something like, well, if you give $10 million to support a school, they're happy and they like it. But if you give $10 million directly to the government budgets, you can do, I think it was more like $50 million. It was a larger amount of money. But if you give this amount of money, you can do whatever you want, right? So that has been part of earlier research in trying to make the argument that it was a very strategic decision, right? Not necessarily so surprising. But I don't know, I don't think that really still, you had the second part of
If
it.
the NGO, it's kind of the NGO model, but you probably haven't encountered it much in those of our countries, but if the sort of outsourcing to the NGOs helps with accountability on delivery,
Yeah, I mean,
even though it still doesn't get the donor credibility issue resolved.
so my inclination would be no. I just was listening to a presentation of a person that had done a lot of work in northern Uganda at the Midwest Political Science meeting last week, and he was talking a lot about this kind of the funding decision, right? So if you constantly have to keep your funding going to keep you going as an NGO, your accountability is still to those people that are providing your funding. Your accountability is not to the people on the ground. So I think it still hasn't solved that accountability problem.
So you raised another question that I don't think that you're covering, that if I'm a recipient country, and I think you started to mention in the beginning, and I'm getting money from here, I'm getting money from this donor, I'm getting money from this donor, and they have conflicting outcomes, or they want conflicting, you know, so I'm going to have a commitment problem right there, but I want all that money. So how do you deal with the intra, you know?
Well, I think my sense is the strategy by recipient governments is that they say yes to everything and then they just don't do what they want to do. And
And what happens to those donors? You know, do the donors just say, fine, I'll take my money and go elsewhere? Or do they say, I still think I can have, because I'll give more money, you know, they'll go my way as opposed to.
yeah, I think that's what's interesting is that there are very, very, very few cases of a donor actually leaving a country. So it really has to be, and actually, I mean, the clearest example of when donors left was in Eritrea, and it was because they were kicked out. So the Eritrean government said, okay, we don't actually want you here. So you have donors who will frequently maybe try to punish, so they cut aid a little bit, but in Uganda, in 2000, a year and a half ago, so you had a major, you can call it corruption, but it was really just theft. So you had a program for Reconstruction in northern Uganda, and it was discovered, interestingly, by the Ugandan auditor, so not by donors, but by the auditor himself, that $11 million of donor money was, it was taken. It was just, it disappeared. And so you had this huge, huge uproar, and you actually led eventually to the suspension of $300 million in aid, which is a huge gap for the Ugandan government. And I was there a year later when aid was starting to come back online. But the thing is that's actually very, very rare. And so now I'm trying to think about, well, why did we actually see collective action in this case? Because you see in so many other places that doesn't actually oftentimes occur. And even now, I mean, aid was suspended, but oftentimes it's a little bit here or a little bit there, and eventually it comes back online, or we just shift it to other portfolios. So we don't give it maybe directly to you, but instead we put it in another direction. And that's why it seems, well, isn't there anything we can do about it? But it's actually quite difficult to figure out, well, what would you actually do besides just kind of leaving? And donors seem very, very hesitant to ever do that.
So, I mean, a really negative stereotype of foreign aid has been, in the last, I don't know, 15 years, that, you know, it's done to rope poor countries into the international economic system, particularly cyclical consumer spending. They're structurally incapable of having an economy like that of their own, and so they're manufactured into economic basket cases that are now in debt, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
What you just described what you just described has a really strong resonance of everybody acting in their perceived short-term self-interest, and that it seems to me that maybe brings everyone's worst motivations to the fore. It facilitates the rise of the most corrupt members of the political class in the recipient countries, maybe, and it gives rise to a flightiness among the donor countries where they're thinking, oh, what's hot this week? What's the trend that we're going to try and sell this week because it's cool and it'll make our company some money. And if there were a movement away from that kind of narrow-minded, short-sighted greed, to put it simply, and more of a view of the long-term health of these countries is in the interests of the global social, global political and economic systems, the attractiveness of the system of foreign aid donation to the most corrupt elements throughout the world would be decreased. And does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so kind of going to the first point you said about the kind of the economic system, I mean, my sense from being in the countries is that things are just way too chaotic for it to ever be that systematic, right? I think it's much more, you might have very similar pathologies that come from it. I think that's what you're also pointing to. But it comes more of kind of from the short-term interest and from the chaotic nature, and also from the fact that we can't forget that aid is an industry. It's a business, and people, these are people's jobs and their procedures, right? So I don't actually think that, there may be some global dynamics to it. I'm not in any way trying to take away from that. But on the ground, and the people that I'm talking to, they're not thinking about kind of these long-term economic systems. They're thinking about, okay, how do I advance my career while also providing some benefits to the country? So they certainly have altruistic motives, right? The people that I interview, they're well-meaning, right? They have the intention to do some good, but the institutional structure is set up in a way that I think is very difficult to do that. And it's very much related to this idea that there is very much a focus on the short term, right? And I think that if we can find a way, I'm not sure exactly how that would happen, to enable particularly donors, and that's what I would focus my policy prescriptions on, to actually make longer term commitments and then actually be able to uphold them, I think that we would see a lot of benefits down the line. I think, you know, we're not going to necessarily change some of these commitment problems from recipient countries, but what we might be able to do is try to pressure donors into making longer term commitments. There are a lot of challenges to that, but I think that it's something that if we really want to see some improvement, it's something that's necessary.
Are there any other questions?
Just maybe a concluding question.
Yeah.
So, you know, we all know these problems exist internationally.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you look at the balance sheets of World Bank, IMF, they virtually always make profit on money they lend.
Yeah.
Right? How is that possible?
Well, because they're a business in that way, right? So this is also, I think there's something very different about the bank than from USAID, from other things, is that they're a bank, right? So they have to be able to keep lending, which means that they have an incentive to continue to give. So speaking about commitment problems, they have an incentive to actually not uphold conditions that they have made because they need to keep lending, right, in order for them to function. And that's something that is different from a USAID because they don't function as a bank in that way.
Just, to go on that, could it, like in the case like IMF or the World Bank, could it force like stricter regulations on money just because they are a private organization that's dealing with it, and not necessarily like the United States saying, you got to do this, but it's really just one country's government to another, and they really can't.
Well, so there's two reasons. First of all is this need to lend, but the other thing is that you should also keep in mind that the bank, or the board for the World Bank is made up of individuals also from these countries, right? So and also for the same thing with the African Development Bank. So you have individuals who are sitting on the board. I mean, I remember someone saying, well, if we don't like the country director of the World Bank, our president, through the person that's sitting on the board, they just call it up to the board and that person is gone. So there's all these interesting elements. We like to think of international organizations as having this capacity to sanction and enforce, but there are all kinds of particularities of the organizations and how they came to be that make it very difficult for you to actually make that final step from enforcement, to do much besides a threat, right? I mean, you even see, it's the same thing, right? It's when you think about security councils and decision making. You have different competing interests on the Security Council, and in the end, oftentimes it's difficult to pass a certain resolution or to approve a peacekeeping mission because not everyone is on board. And the same kind of dynamics also happen in those organizations around foreign aid.
Wonderful. Well, please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you very much.
Please help yourself to food.
Did you still talk to Josh?
Our online course last Wednesday. Sure.
Is he telling you shit? I didn't see him. I didn't see him. I got a new phone. I think I don't know. Lex is still on one. I don't know. You know, we're still on there.
Military course, just like, hey, do this. You're like,
That's what you're looking at them.
I got your phone.
Week before, you know, it's like, you can't do this. Because I'm like, dude, you get this lake or something. Even a midterm test, he's been dissecting the shark for 7 hours. You know, so I was like, dude, why didn't you say something beforehand? You know, I wouldn't something, no.
Well, it went through.
You know.
Oh yeah, you probably gonna do, but I haven't texted
I mean, this is like a normal class, you know, I have some leeway here. You know, so, you know, I mean, he's going to recite probably
the stand-up, yeah, he's pretty cool.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read, you know, my wife's grandmother, you know,
I just thought about it, I was like,
you know, it keeps saying hours, and it keeps going down.
Well, no, I knew you guys.
You know, so, you know, that's why it's like, I even,
Right, that's how I met Josh.
I was like, no, you know, it's just entirely good to my show. You know, so, you know, it wasn't one I probably should have taken anyways, you know, so, I need one of them.
I was planning on taking a couple of those summer, probably. I used to just take online courses before those, but